The phantom time hypothesis. After the seriousness of the lost cosmonauts, it can be helpful to examine the idea that conspiracy theories can be a little bit more abstract. While they typically entail a shadowy scheme to exploit a large group of people, there are theories that can seem to be far stranger. One of these is the phantom time hypothesis. First put forward by the German writer and historian Herbert Illig, the theory suggests that there has been a huge error in our dating system. More specifically, the period between 614 AD and 911 AD simply does not exist. This part of the early Middle Ages was instead fabricated, with anything said to have happened during this time being either equally as fabricated or simply having occurred earlier. According to Illig, we have a gap in our calendar of nearly 300 years. As a means of explanation, Illig suggests that the period was inserted into the calendar as the result of a millennium-old conspiracy. The theory begins with the head of the Holy Roman Empire, Otto III, as he collaborates with the man who was head of the Catholic Church at the time, Pope Sylvester II. It may even have included the leader of the Byzantine Empire, Constantine VII, but the chief protagonist remains the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. It is Illig's assertion that the pair colluded together to alter the known date and to bring them closer to the year 1000 AD. At the same time, it permitted them the ability to invent 3 centuries of history. One of their most famous inventions would be Charlemagne. They were to accomplish this with a campaign of misrepresentation, forgery, altering of documents, and the construction of physical evidence. Were this theory to be true, the year 2010 would actually be 1713, 2015 would be 718, and so on. If Illig is correct, then we are still very much in the 18th century. But while the theory might seem to be incredibly outlandish, how is it possible to simply conjure up 300 years of history? Illig does strive to bring evidence to the table. It is in this respect that the phantom time hypothesis is truly one of the most notable conspiracy theories around. If it were proved to be true, it would entail a secretive collusion of epic proportions. Simply by dint of the hypothesis it advances, it is worthy of looking deeper into the reasons as to why we might possibly have lost 300 years of our history. The first piece of evidence Illig puts forward is the lack of actual archaeological evidence that can be reliably dated to the phantom time period. While the time period around the early Middle Ages has become colloquially known as the Dark Ages, it represents a fall-off from the technological and cultural high-water marks of the Roman period, as the Roman Empire crumbled, or at least as they moved their centre of power from Rome to Byzantium. To take Britain as an example, the departure of the Romans left behind a huge amount of infrastructure and architecture that could not be replicated for many hundreds of years. As the Romans pulled back throughout Europe, they left behind a cultural vacuum which other smaller and less dominant peoples soon stepped into. Unlike the huge ruins, artefacts and landmarks left behind by the Romans, the peoples from this period left us with comparatively little. For Illig, this inability to use radiometrics and dendrochronological means to date items to this period is indicative of the fact that they simply did not happen. While we have come to rely on medieval writers and historians to fill us in on what happened during the period, the theory suggests that these writings were simply invented to fill in the gaps as Otto III and Sylvester II attempted to jump the calendar forwards. The second point of evidence for the theory again turns towards the Romans in a search for proof. So dominant and influential throughout Europe, it can be easy to trace the history of the Romans across many parts of Europe even today. Whether it's their roads, their walls, or just general housing, there are few countries in southern, central and western Europe that do not possess the evidence of Roman presence in the area. But Illig argues the fact that some of the continent's Romanesque buildings can be dated to the 10th century demonstrates the fact that the collapse of the Roman Empire might not have been so far in the past. While it's commonly thought that the collapse of the empire took with it the cultural and architectural advances the Romans had learned, the fact that countries were still constructing these late-period Roman buildings is, the theory suggests, evidence that their demise was actually far closer to the modern day than we could have expected. One of the more technical pieces of evidence that Illig uses involves the calendar system used during the period. The interplay between the Julian and the Gregorian calendar has caused much confusion, and it is this switch, the theory argues, that has allowed the conspiracy to alter the dates to significant effect. It begins with the Julian calendar, introduced by and named for one of the most famous Romans of all, Julius Caesar. The Julian method of dating had one notable issue, in that for every century it counted, there would be a discrepancy of 1 day. The Gregorian calendar, conversely, held no such issue. Introduced in 1582 AD, the people who were implementing the calendar knew the errors present in the older system and were required to backdate it accordingly. With the Julian system out by a day for every century in use, this should have resulted in a discrepancy totaling 13 days, which would need to be adjusted for. However, those who introduced the calendar discovered, thanks to their mathematical and astronomical skills, that they only needed to adjust the calendar by 10 days. The Julian calendar ended on the 4th of October 1582, and the new Gregorian calendar began on the 15th of October 1582. For Illig, this is enough evidence to suggest that there has been the removal of 3 centuries from the common history books some time before. Those 3 missing days, as calculated by the best minds of the time, relate to the 3 missing centuries that were removed by the conspiracy. Central to Illig's argument, however, is the famed figure of Charlemagne. As a key figure in European history, he is a hero in France, Germany, and many other cultures across the continent. His story of uniting various disparate tribes and bringing them all under one rule is akin to the work of Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great. Accordingly, he is apportioned the same amount of reference. Not only was he thought to be a great warrior and statesman, but he was also an architect, an astronomer, a philosopher, and a teacher. His range of achievements is so great that, for Illig, it seems to be unbelievable. Rather than a real man, Charlemagne is a creation of those who rewrote the history books. He was literally conjured up as a folk hero and created to fit the profile of one who would have his work revered for centuries. It is not that Charlemagne is not great enough to have existed, but rather that he is too great. No one man could have accomplished everything attributed to him, so instead it must have been that the stories were embellished, exaggerated, or simply just invented in order to fill the 3 centuries of history that the conspiracy was attempting to insert into the calendar. But as well as the evidence Illig puts forward for his conspiracy, others have hit back with counter-arguments. The first of these brings ancient astronomical findings into the equation. We have records from the Chinese Tang dynasty that detail their exact view of the night sky. These well-dated government-approved papers actually include references to known cosmic events such as solar eclipses and the passing of Halley's Comet. When compared against the modern calendar, the one that positions us in the 21st century, we discover that there is no discrepancy to be found. Instead, it perfectly aligns with what is to be expected were the phantom time period theory to be false. Secondly, when examined closely, the archaeological evidence we have gathered and tested does show that the period known as the early Middle Ages did in fact exist. Rather than simply looking at the ruins of the Roman Empire, it is possible for us to recover, examine, and date the artefacts we find from around the world. Many of these locations, such as India or China, involved cultures distant to Europe, who were working under their own volition and were unencumbered by any conspiratorial efforts to dictate changes to their calendar. When we look back through their history, there is nothing to suggest that 3 centuries of their past have been rapidly inserted. In many cases, these cultures used very different calendars to the Julian or Gregorian systems, so the concept of 1000 AD and its importance would be entirely lost on them. When looking closer at the theory about the discrepancies between the calendar systems, Illig's argument begins to fall apart. First, it was never the intention of the Gregorian calendar to follow on directly from the Julian calendar's beginnings in 45 BC. Instead, it was designed to trace back its lineage and start from 325 BC, the time of the Council of Nicaea. The council, one of the most important gatherings in the history of the Western world, was the meeting at which a huge amount of the doctrine of the Catholic Church was codified. As well as coming to an agreement on which books of the Bible were to be considered official, there was also established a means of figuring out the exact date of Easter Sunday. As such, the Gregorian calendar was not missing 3 days, equivalent to centuries, when it replaced the Julian calendar. Rather, it was purposely designed to use calculations that began 300 years after Illig purports. This, it seems, is the source of his missing centuries. On the subject of Charlemagne and the idea that he may have been a fabricated historical figure, this does not tally with the information that exists in other cultures around the world. For such an important figure on the European and world stage, it would have been impossible for Charlemagne to operate in a vacuum. As such, we see records of his actions and deeds in the recorded histories of Britain, the Vatican, and even the Byzantine Empire. As well as this, the period which Illig suggests was invented corresponds almost directly with the time when Muhammad was beginning the expansion of Islam into parts of the world which had previously been controlled by the Romans, including parts of Portugal and Spain. During the Islamic expansion, they fought battles with other cultures, including the Tang dynasty in China. The resulting Battle of Talos was recorded by both cultures and is known to have happened during the purported Phantom Time period. While Illig's theory holds a certain brash romanticism, it is hard to find definitive evidence that might hold up over time. There is no need to question the motivations he ascribes to the conspirators Otto III and Sylvester II, as the insertion of such a large period would have placed them in power at the turn of the millennium. Depending on their individual beliefs, this could have been a matter of great pride and importance. Instead, the conspiracy falls down simply because it's impossible to separate the history of Europe from the rest of the world. This ethnocentric approach ultimately dooms a fascinating theory. However, should Illig be able to expand his ideas and discover real evidence of a global conspiracy to invent 3 centuries of history, then we would be witness to one of the most dramatic, important and interesting revelations of our time. The end. Don't forget to like and subscribe and press the wee bell notification. And a huge big thank you to all my subscribers and patrons. See you next week. Bye bye.